Hi everybody. So today I'm going to be going through the educational topic of Sociology AQA A-Level. This video will be specifically on the internal and external factors of differences in educational achievement. And yeah, I found that there was quite a lack of resources online for Sociology AQA A-Level, so I decided to make this slideshow based on the textbook and some of the notes that I've made over the years, and also some of my class notes that I was taught by my teachers, and also the PowerPoints that my teachers used. So yeah, let's get started. So this is the specification for education. And today we're going to be going through the one highlighted, which is differential educational achievement of social groups by social class, gender and ethnicity in contemporary society. This video will focus on the social class aspect of this, which would be about 1 or 2 paragraphs of a 30 marker and maybe a full 10 marker. So we're going to start with differences in educational achievement, the external factors. On the right, we can see the 3 different topics that this is split up into. This is also done in the textbook. It is split into cultural deprivation, material deprivation, and cultural capital. So to begin with, cultural deprivation. We start with Bernstein and his speech codes. So this speech codes are essentially basically how students speak and the type of vocabulary they use. So he identifies 2 types. This is the restricted code and the elaborate code. So the elaborate code, which is normally used by working class, consists of limited vocabulary and grammar, while the elaborate code includes sophisticated vocabulary and grammar and is typically used by middle class children, as it is taught at a young age and that's how they are socialized. So our application of this is that the elaborate code is awarded in the national curriculum, and therefore students who use it are seen as more intelligent and therefore perform better. This also puts working class children at a disadvantage, as they're not raised on the elaborate code, they are raised on the restricted code. On the other hand, middle class children are at an advantage due to the elaborate code being taught at a young age, aka through their primary socialization. Next is cultural deprivation, again, but this time we are going through parental education. And this is, a sociologist for this is called Douglas. He suggests that parenting style, educational behaviours, and use of income are what also impact the differences in educational achievement. So, middle class parents have consistent discipline and emphasis on school with high expectations of children, while working class parenting style is inconsistent and harsh. So, by inconsistent and harsh, I mean they are highly disciplined, but it's inconsistent in what, and it's not all the time. This demotivates the working class child's independence and the will to put effort into education. The consistent discipline and emphasis on school with these high expectations make middle class children work harder in education, while working class parents don't actually discipline based on education itself. They discipline more on how well you just behave in general. The next one is parental education behaviours. So middle class parents are more knowledgeable on what could help their child at school, as they experienced a positive education system when they were younger, and therefore they care more about education and they can help more. And this definitely will cause middle class children to perform better, as their parents know how to help them and their parents care more, which means the middle class children will automatically care more and will be forced to care more. And this works vice versa. Working class parents are less knowledgeable, can help less. They don't attend parents' evenings because they don't understand the importance of helping their child. And this socializes the child to think that way, which will make them care a lot less on education and they will perform not as well. Lastly is the use of income and income in general. Working class parents do not have the expenditure to spend lots of money on resources for school, which means they have a lack of equipment and they are not equipped to learn to the max at school. And obviously it also works vice versa, where middle class parents can afford it. They can afford tutors and textbooks and additional resources for children, which can significantly improve performance at school. Still on cultural deprivation, now we are looking at different types of working class subcultures. So our sociologist, Sugarman, identifies 4 working class subcultures. The first is a fatalistic subculture, which they believe that you can't do anything to change your status and therefore there is no point in trying. How this applies to education is that these subcultures and these parents will implement this fatalistic outlook on their own children, and therefore their children will accept their working class identity and not put any effort into school to get out of that identity, and therefore they are fatalistic. The next is collectivism, which is when they place value on group success over individual success. So this means that the child would put more effort into improving as a family instead of improving alone at school, which means they neglect their educational responsibilities as they see maybe putting in more effort at home for housework and house chores to be more valued. Therefore, they are collectivists. They care more about the family more than their own independent success at school. The next is immediate gratification. This is seeking rewards and pleasure now rather than sacrificing for their long-term goals. So, for example, they may spend more money on temporary things instead of investing their money into longer-term goals. And also, how this applies to education is by, instead of working and doing homework for their knowledge for their exams in the end, they are seeking teacher approval and praise instead of doing well in the end goal. The next is present time orientation, which is a lack of long-term goals, as they believe the present is more important than the future. Therefore, they are only working to a certain time and they are not looking for success in the future, but they are kind of only looking at, it's very similar to immediate gratification. It's kind of what immediate gratification is based off of. So yeah. Next, we are on to the next heading, material deprivation. Material deprivation is basically not having enough money and income and not having enough materials in general to afford stuff. For example, housing. Poor housing affects education. It's a plain AO1 statement. For example, overcrowding in the house, as they may have smaller housing. A lot of housing and council housing have 1 bedrooms and 1 rooms and 1 bathroom, and working class families tend to be larger, and this causes a greater risk of getting ill. And how that impacts education is, if the child gets ill, they are absent more and therefore they miss a lot of vital learning. Also, there is little space for education activities such as studying. There's no study spaces, there's no places to do homework, and there's no places to do school projects that contribute to grades and coursework and stuff like that. Therefore, the child feels they have no place to be doing their education activities, which means they just don't do it in general, which is obviously impactful. Another effect of poor housing and overcrowding is they don't get proper rest. And proper rest leads to poorer performance at school and in lessons, and therefore they probably don't pay much attention in class, which means they are not gaining the vital learning that they need. Another issue with housing is temporary housing. Due to tenancy and renting and not owning properties and council homes, working class families are moved around a lot, and children are constantly moving around due to financial instability, and this leads to a disturbed education as the child is constantly changing schools or is having to travel very far to get to school, and this change in learning environment, can lead the child to feel, one, very confused on what they should be doing and what topics they're learning, and different schools work at different paces, so the child would have to either catch up or would be ahead and then therefore would lack so much motivation, so the child would feel overwhelmed. So that's how the education will be disturbed. Another factor of material deprivation is diet and health. Our sociologist for this is Howard. Howard argues that lower intakes of energy through food weakens the immune system of the child, again, making the child more prone to getting ill and being absent and missing a lot of vital learning. Another one is the cost of education. Most working class families cannot afford to pay for basic stationery, books and trips, and etc. They don't have the expenditure to spend money on this, and therefore the child lacks resources, while middle class children can afford tutors, they can afford textbooks, they can afford additional educational services, and they can afford other formats of information on their topics. You can buy, typically people sell their notes and their information and their A1 and stuff online, and middle class children can afford that while working class children cannot, and that puts them, middle class children, at an advantage because they have access to resources that working class students do not. And lastly, the fear of debt. As they grew up, so moving on to higher education and being around 17, 18 and applying for university, a lot of middle class children can afford it because they grew up around money. However, working class children grew up around debt, and through maybe a conscious or even an unconscious desire to get out of debt and to not reproduce and end up in the same position as their parents, they will avoid going to university as they are scared of going into debt and they are scared of not having enough money in the end. And this prevents them from receiving higher education and advanced education, which reproduces class inequalities and educational achievement as a whole, as these working class students in secondary and sixth form are no longer working towards higher education and therefore put less effort into school, as they're not working to get in anywhere. They are only studying for the sake of going to school now, as it is compulsory until age 18. While middle class students are now working towards universities such as Bristol, Cambridge, Oxford, and that means they are putting in so much more effort so they can get into these schools, which explains the difference in educational achievement between the two. Now, lastly, our last point is cultural capital. Our sociologist for this is the one and only Bordeaux. He argues that middle class children with cultural capital are way better equipped to meet the demands of the national curriculum. The national curriculum has an overrepresentation of middle class culture, and it is basically based off of middle class culture. For example, it's based off of, in literature, it's based off of Shakespeare and a lot of like texts and stuff that are taught in middle class culture through especially literature. Growing up, middle class children are probably very surrounded by literature and British literature, while working class students are probably not. Working class students are definitely deprived of middle class culture and therefore lack cultural capital, which means they are going to naturally do worse in the education system as they were not surrounded and socialized with that cultural capital that's necessary to do well in the education system. Now, time to evaluate external factors of social class and differences in educational achievement. The first evaluation point is the myth of cultural capital. So, a sociologist, Nell Keddy, argues in The Myth of Cultural Deprivation. She argues that working class children are not actually deprived, but are instead culturally different. Basically, she's saying that this whole point is too deterministic and too fatalistic, and it's too ignorant of how that we shouldn't accept this overrepresentation of middle class culture, and instead we should fix the education system and the national curriculum and celebrate more working class culture instead of victim blaming and saying that working class children are deprived and that they don't have what the education system wants, and instead of complaining about that, we should switch it and start representing working class culture, because it's unfair to keep preaching middle class culture and force these working class children to learn a completely different culture from their own. And another evaluation point is material deprivation is not the sole explanation. For example, schools are implementing new policies such as introduction of free school meals, compensatory education, which aims to provide extra resources for children, providing stationery, books, textbooks, and educational resources. Therefore, families no longer actually need to financially contribute anymore, which doesn't explain material deprivation anymore. So that is the whole of external factors of social class and differences in educational achievement. Also, free school meals will come up in our policy section. So, educational policy will be in another video. Now we are on to differences in educational achievement, but internal factors. So the two factors that these are split up into are labeling theory and subcultures and identities. First, under labeling theory, I feel like it's its own in itself actually, is the hidden curriculum. So I broke this point down into kind of how you would structure a paragraph using AO1, AO2, and AO3, which are AO1 is your knowledge, AO2 is your application of that knowledge to your topic, and AO3 is your evaluation. AO1 for the hidden curriculum is things that you learn in school that are not explicitly taught as part of the curriculum, such as being on time or obeying authority figures. For example, obeying teachers, listening to teachers, being told what to do, or being punished for being late, and having detentions, and being taught certain social norms and expectations. And this continues on to the workplace, as, for example, being late is punished and being on time is praised, causing individuals when they reach the workplace era to only be on time to maximize efficiency at work. The end goal for education, especially for functionalists, is to prepare the child for the workplace. Therefore, for example, obeying authority and teachers would mirror obeying your boss. And it prepares you to become, as a functionalist would say, a function in society and a function to the economy. However, our criticism of the hidden curriculum is that it's not actually so hidden anymore, as we literally study it in sociology now. It's not hidden anymore, and therefore students become a lot more conscious of this and therefore have free will and can act against this. So it's not so hidden anymore. Now, our main one is labeling theory. Labeling theory is introduced by Becker. Remember Becker is very important. Becker comes up in crime, Becker comes up in education, Becker comes up in beliefs, and I'm sure Becker comes up in family. I'm not too sure. I haven't gone through those topics yet. So Becker argues that teachers judge students based on their appearance, speech, gender, and behaviour, and therefore place a label on them based on how closely they fit the ideal pupil stereotype. The ideal pupil stereotype is a child who's well behaved, on time, passive, obedient, and school focused, while also not trying too hard. And based in this situation, labeling is based on their class. Working class students tend to receive negative labels as they are seen as unintelligent, which dampens motivation and self-concept, leading to a poor performance at school. Therefore, due to this negative label, they receive less support from their teachers, as teachers would focus on children who have more potential. They see working class children as lost causes and therefore will give up on them and focus on middle class students who can achieve really well. This leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a student receives a positive label, they react to it by giving themselves a positive self-concept, which motivates them in school, and vice versa. If they receive a negative label, they will give themselves a negative self-concept and internalize that label, and they will become demotivated in school. A key study for this is Rosenthal and Jacobson, who informed teachers the IQs of children, except they told some of the teachers that certain children had higher IQs even if they didn't. So they basically lied and said these kids have really high IQs, but they didn't. And these children were labeled as spurts. Now, they found that those children who were labeled as spurts improved significantly at school as they started receiving more teacher attention. Therefore, they placed a label on the students based on their IQ and aka their behavior, and just like an objective stereotype, and therefore put more effort into those students, and that caused those students to perform better, showing that labeling does actually impact educational achievement. And our application of this, bringing in theory, is that interactionists call this looking at glass half, where these students are basing their identities off of what teachers think of them, which is basing your self-concept based on what others think of you. That's looking at glass half. Now, lastly, for labeling theory, we've got streaming. Students who are labelled as unintelligent, which, as we all know, are always not always, but mostly working class students, end up in lower streams and sets, where they are capped and also receive less teacher attention, stunting improvement. They are placed into a tripartite. Those who will pass anyways, who are set 1 and 2, but they still put effort into those students to maintain that, or they're going to pass anyways. Those who can improve, students in about set 3 and 4, as you know, they're going to put a lot of effort into those children because due to marketization, they want as many students as they can to achieve well. So therefore, they're going to help these students, these C students, these B students, get those A's and A stars and 8s and 9s so that their school looks better. However, a lot of students are seen as lost causes too. These are students in bottom sets. And we all know those quote-unquote unintelligent students are working class students, and they are seen as lost causes, and therefore they receive very little teacher attention, and they just don't perform well because teachers give up on them and they no longer learn anymore. Next is pupil subcultures and identities, which is our second topic for internal factors. So first we'll go through pupil subcultures. Our sociologist for this is Lacey, and Lacey found that there were 2 ways in which pupil subcultures developed. 1, polarization. This is when pupils respond to streaming by moving to two ends of the spectrum, anti-school or pro-school. Like a magnet, they go to two poles, north and south. You know? That's how I remember it. Polarization, north and south poles. They go to two ends, anti and pro. And another type is differentiation. This is the process of which teachers categorize students based on perception of attitudes and behaviors, where those in high streams have high status and vice versa. Different labeling is a form of differentiation. It's literally when they separate students based on their abilities, aka streaming. And instead of polarization, where they respond by moving to two ends of the spectrum, there's a variety of pupil responses. For example, ingratiation, which is becoming a teacher's pet. Ritualism, which means the student just chooses to stay out of trouble. Retreatism was the daydreamers and the children who muck about. And rebellion is complete rejection of the education system, but either not coming in, disrespecting the teacher, and overall just not doing anything at all to do with school. They just don't care. Now, for pupil identities, we're going to talk about habitus. Habitus is the ways of thinking that are shared by a social class. There is a working class habitus, there is a middle class habitus, there is an upper class habitus. However, in sociology, we rarely talk about the upper class. It's all middle class and working class. And these habiti are formed based on a response to their position in the class structure. So they base their identities and their ways of thinking on how they are treated in society, basically. And therefore, working class students form something called a Nike identity. This is because they are aware of society looking down on them, so they create other ways to create self-worth. They create a working class identity and brand themselves like a Nike identity as a working class individual. And this leads to self-exclusion from education as they feel their chosen identity of a working class individual does not align with the education system, aka it does not suit their habitus, and therefore they neglect school and they reject education as a whole, because it's kind of like a defense mechanism against oppression and inequality, and therefore they just choose to exclude themselves instead of being excluded. That's how I see it. Now, at AO3, for this, is schools are still aiming to tackle this through policies such as pupil premium, gist and free school meals. Schools internally are all trying to actively stop this. There are Ofsted observations which prevent teachers from being able to be like this in the education system. So therefore, there are lots of internal policies and phenomenon that do try to stop these internal factors of oppression and inequality against working class students. So yeah, this is for the next video, but anyways, thank you so much. If you guys have any questions on differences in educational achievement on social class, please jot them in the comments down below and I will aim to answer them if I can, unless it's years later and I've given up on A-Level Sociology, because guess what? I'm almost done. I hope this was helpful. It's not incredible detail and it's not as much detail as the textbook. However, I do find that it's almost impossible to memorize everything, so I thought I would list down some of the things I think are important enough to go into a 30 marker and some of the really important information. So yeah, thank you so much everybody. I hope this helped and stay tuned for the rest because I will be posting this as soon as I physically can. Okay, thank you, bye bye.